Hello and welcome to this instalment of the Lafayette Club's online lecture series. Today's event is titled The Misguided War on Drugs, a conversation with Professor David Nutt. Professor Nutt is the Edmond J. Safra Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and Director of the Neuropsychopharmacology Unit in the Division of Brain Sciences, both at Imperial College London. Previously, he served as Chair of the Advisory Committee on the Misuse of Drugs and is currently Chair of DrugScience, a UK-based drugs advisory committee which strives to provide clear, evidence-based drug information without political or commercial interference. He's the author of several books, including Drugs Without the Hot Air, Making Sense of Legal and Illegal Drugs, the first edition of which won the Transmission Prize for the Communication of Ideas 2014. Professor Nutt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for the invitation.
So I'd like to spend the first part of the interview talking about the underlying science of drug addiction and the clinical applications of drugs, and then talk more about drug policy in the UK and the implications it has for scientists, drug users, be they addicts or otherwise, and society as a whole. But to start us off, could you just give us a little insight into your background as a doctor and scientist, what a neuropsychopharmacologist does exactly?
I'm a psychiatrist. I'm a doctor by training, a psychiatrist by training, also a bit of neurology as well. So I'm always been interested in the brain, but I'm very interested in the use of drugs to probe brain function, because as you probably all know, the brain is essentially a chemical organ. Communication in the brain is through chemical neurotransmitters. There are about 80 of them. To understand their function, we can perturb them by using drugs which either block them or stimulate them. And my claim to fame is I've probably given more different kinds of drugs to human beings than anyone alive or maybe even dead. I don't think there's any kind of major drug target in the brain I haven't actually studied pharmacologically. So neuropsychopharmacology is the use of basically pharmacology to study neuroscience.
So, as you said, you've worked with a lot of drugs, and in your book, Drugs Without the Hot Air, you give a comprehensive account of all the major drugs available legally and illegally in the UK today, as well as the factors that have resulted in their prohibition or lack thereof. It's a broad question, but can you talk a little about why it is that we get addicted to certain drugs but not to others, as well as what the factors are that increase the likelihood of addiction for different individuals?
Sure. But addiction varies from drug to drug. And that tells us, at least in part, it's got something to do with the pharmacology of the drug. And the most addictive drugs actually are drugs which release dopamine, so particularly drugs like heroin, cocaine, tobacco. Although tobacco is complicated because it's probably the most addictive drug of all, but that's complicated by the fact it's legally available. So drugs which produce a great deal of a great high, particularly, and therefore lead to withdrawal and craving, they're particularly addictive, and the dopamine system is likely to be partly involved in that. But then there are other drugs which are illegal, drugs like LSD and magic mushrooms, which actually are not addictive at all. In fact, they're anti-addictive. And one of the problems with the current drug laws is that everyone assumes that all illegal drugs are addictive, because they must, why would they be illegal if they weren't addictive? And so you get into this rather circular kind of discussion that people assume that the legal status has some relevance or bears some evidence of their harms, and particularly addictiveness, and it doesn't. And then the other factors relating to addiction, well, clearly the majority of people who use any drug don't get addicted, and that tells us there must be non-drug factors, and those non-drug factors, some of them are genetic and some of them are social. And actually a lot of people become dependent on drugs like opiates and alcohol in an attempt to kind of mitigate the misery of their lives and to deal with the chronic social distress and the social stress and fill gaps in their lives which they're not getting filled with relationships or with work. And a lot of people turn to alcohol to deal with conditions like like anxiety and depression, and so they sort of self-medicate and become addicted that way. And then there are just some people who find that drugs sort of throw a switch and they're like the missing link, the missing piece of the jigsaw in their brain, and they often become addicted to drugs at a very early age, because without the drug they don't seem to be normal. They're not right, and so they're always trying to fill that gap that's left if they don't take the drug.
So Before we dive into the impacts that different drugs are having in the UK, along with the associated drug policies, I'd like to talk about a couple of different avenues of research that are showing a lot of promise for the clinical applications of drugs that have perhaps been overlooked in the past. Could you comment on the roles that ketamine and, although in a different way, psilocybin may play in treating people with depression?
Well, yeah, I mean, and addiction as well. In fact, I think we should give credit, particularly for in relation to ketamine. I mean, ketamine was being used in Russia. In Russia, they don't allow what we call substitution therapy. Basically, if you're a heroin addict, and it's quite easy to become a heroin addict in Russia because it's very close to Afghanistan, and many Russian soldiers, when they were in Afghanistan, came back addicted. They don't believe in treatment. They don't believe in methadone or buprenorphine. So it's abstinence or nothing, and that's led to, and they don't have harm reduction in terms of needle exchange. So that's they're very, very high death rates for opiate use there. And a guy called Krupitsky showed that ketamine, this dissociative anesthetic, which perturbs the brain in a very powerful way for a few hours, could be used to help disrupt people's drug seeking with heroin. That hasn't been rolled out as much as it should be, because that work was about 20 years old. But now a group in the University of Exeter and Celia Morgan have now done a similar study in the UK and shown, I think, some effect on alcoholism. But then there's psilocybin, magic mushrooms. So magic mushrooms were used back in the 50s and 60s as sort of the poor relation, the sort of smaller brother to LSD. And LSD actually turned out to be a very interesting treatment for alcoholism. The man that founded Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, cured his alcoholism through a psychedelic experience, and then became a tremendous protagonist for LSD. And he persuaded the US government to fund 6 trials of LSD for alcoholism. And they were very effective. Unfortunately, the drug got banned in the 60s, and perhaps we'll come back to that later. And so it hasn't been trialed since. But what has been trialed in recent years in the US is psilocybin, the active ingredient of magic mushrooms. And there have been 2 open trials, one for smoking and one for alcoholism. The smoking one was conducted by Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins, and it was remarkable. I mean, of the 18 people in his trial, 15 stopped smoking and just stopped smoking. They had 3 psychedelic trips over the course of about 3 months or so. And they for many of them, they just said, I've no interest, it's completely changed my attitude to tobacco. I no longer want it, crave it. In fact, I find it distasteful. So that's a really powerful outcome. And there's no other treatment for smoking that has actually got such a high proportion of people abstinent. And then a guy called Michael Bogenschutz in New Mexico did a similar study in alcoholism, where he was putting people through a normal psychotherapy program over sort of 14 weeks or so, and he gave them a couple of psilocybin trips. And again, he found profound effects, particularly from the first trip, in reducing alcohol consumption. And actually now, just out of interest, we've just finished our trial of MDMA for alcoholism as well. And that's going to be
my next question.
Okay.
Sorry,
that's coming out, I think, next week. And that showed a very powerful impact of just 2 MDMA sessions under psychotherapy with an attempt to deal with the psychological stresses which are leading people to drink. That actually turned out to be a very powerful treatment for alcoholism as well. So we got 3 recent examples of illegal drugs being potentially very useful in addictions, but very hard to roll out because they're illegal.
So your most cited paper is titled Drug Harms in the UK, a multi-criteria decision analysis, and was published in 2010. I was wondering if you could summarize the main findings of the paper, as well as the accompanying fallout.
Sure. So well, the main findings were that if you set up a structured assessment for drug harms, you probably get the closest you're ever going to get to a real scale of harms. I mean, assessing drug harms is challenging at the best of times. It's particularly difficult for drugs which are illegal, because you don't have very good data on who's using it and how much they're using and even what they're using. So what we decided to do was basically work out how many ways there were in which drugs could cause harm. And that's the first stage of what's called a decision conference. And when we looked at them, it turned out that there were 16 independent ways in which drugs can harm people. 9 are harms to the user, and 7 are harms to society. And so we're having determined those harms, we then produce definitions of each. And then we chose 20 drugs, some legal drugs, alcohol, tobacco, butane, I think, and some illegal drugs, heroin, cocaine, etc. And we subjected those 20 drugs to a decision conference where we ranked every drug on each of those 16 scales, with the most harmful drug being 100 and the least harmful drug being 0. And all the other drugs are scored proportionate to the highest drugs. So a drug, if heroin was the most harmful drug in terms of likelihood of killing you every time you take it, which it is, then you look at other drugs, and if it's 50%, if they're half as likely to kill you when you take it, it's 50, etc. So then you get ratio scales for all those 16 variables. And with ratio scales, you can compare them. And in that way, you can compare what concerns about deforestation in Brazil or Peru in terms of cocaine production, trying to stop cocaine production, the war in Afghanistan, social problems from alcohol. You can compare things of completely different parameters on these scales. And we did that and put it through this computer program called HighView, and eventually it spewed out the results. And so to my surprise, alcohol came out as the most harmful drug in the UK. And that was not because it's the most harmful drug to the user. I think crystal meth and crack cocaine came out higher. But it's the most harmful drug to other people, to society, because it's so widely used. And it was my arguing that alcohol was the most harmful drug and therefore should be the target of most intervention by the government that led me into trouble, because the government at the time didn't want to hear that. It wanted us to focus on drugs like MDMA and magic mushrooms, which are trivial in comparison to the harms of alcohol. So I got sacked as the government's chief advisor.
Well, on the topic of alcohol, I'd like to hear your thoughts on university drinking culture. I think in your book, you make the point that whilst most students are prepared to subscribe to the drinking culture at university for a few years they're there, by the time they graduate, they have, to a certain degree, irrevocably changed their relationship with alcohol. Do you think there are measures that universities can take to counteract this?
Yeah, I do. I have to say, university drinking culture is a great worry. It leads to a lot of damage. People die. In big American universities, I think each one has 3 or 4 deaths each year on their 21st birthday, which is a drinking age in America. So alcohol kills you, and we've had deaths in Britain. It's particularly worrying when people engage in drinking games, where competitive drinking or where drinking is a forfeit for losing some kind of game, and that can lead to people dying. And then I think the point you were kind of alluding to is that most students survive, and most students aren't massively damaged, but many of them are set on a path where alcohol becomes such a dominant factor in their lives that they end up suffering as a result. And I gave an example from my own university days. I mean, 2 of the 9 medical undergraduates at my college at Cambridge, one died of alcoholism, and one had his career severely challenged by alcoholism. So that's quite a high proportion, 2 out of 9. So what universities should do, the first thing, they shouldn't subsidize drinking. Drinking is much cheaper now than it was when I was an undergraduate. The real price of alcohol in relation to my grant was about 3 times what it is now in real terms. And so at the very least, universities and Parliament should not subsidize drinking. That would be my first message. The second is, stop making it cool. I mean, I think universities, some are doing that. You should ban hazing, ban initiation events, because I mean, I understand they're traditional. I understand they've been going on for hundreds of years. I understand they're about bonding in team sports, but they're also very dangerous and stupid, and they're not necessary. And if you really think that getting your initiates so drunk that they can't even find their way home, and they end up losing all their money or their bikes, I'm not sure what you're achieving. You're actually kind of demeaning the person as well as kind of yourselves are engaging in that. So I think universities should have actually much stricter policies on alcohol, and they should be much more rational about other drugs, because most other drugs are less harmful. Very few the drug that's most likely to damage students is alcohol.
Some of your recent research is focused on creating less dangerous alternatives to alcohol. Could you explain how these substances would work?
Yeah, if I sort of just roll back the years a bit, in my PhD, I discovered an antidote to alcohol. I could get a rat really drunk. He couldn't stand up, and I could give him this drug, and he'd become perfectly normal. And I was so excited. I thought, I found it. I've cracked alcohol. I've got an antidote. I went to my professor. I said, I've got an antidote for alcohol. He said, what's the point of that? And I said, well, you could sober up, and you might remember where your home was, etc., where your keys are. And he said, yeah, but the alcohol still kill you because it's still poisonous. It's still rot your liver and rot your heart. And I went away with tail between my legs. Thought, yeah, that's true. You know, blocking the intoxicating effects of alcohol that's not really a therapy. And then I started working on ways of treating alcoholism and working on ways of improving withdrawal. And after about 20 years of this and not making much progress, I was working with the government, the Department of Trade and Industry, looking at, in the part of the Foresight program, looking at what was going to happen, how science could change our approach to drugs, including alcohol. And it's brainstormed one day, if we can't block the harmful effects of alcohol, particularly you can't block the harmful effects on the liver and the heart, why don't we just replace alcohol? And at that time, we had the beginnings of the science around what alcohol does in the brain, and that's progressed. So what I've been doing now is I've been looking for substances which mimic in the brain the good effects of alcohol by targeting the regions that these effects come from, but which don't promote the bad effects of alcohol, which occur in different parts of the brain on different receptors. And by separating essentially pharmacologically the targets, we're able to find substances. We have done that already now. We have substances which can mimic the relaxation, the sociability, the conviviality of alcohol without getting you really drunk and without giving you a hangover. So we're sort of part way to the solution. The next stage, of course, is take these molecules, or the best one, and take it through food safety testing so you can actually sell it as a safe food product, like, you know, alongside alcohol.
Okay. So thinking more about drug policy in the UK, one of your past criticisms of the UK government's drug policies is that they've reflected a much greater desire to reduce drug prevalence and use rather than focusing on harm reduction, despite the fact that the former has repeatedly been shown to be a counterproductive approach to minimizing the impact of drug abuse. One recent example of this in the UK has been in prisons, where the introduction of urine testing for inmates has precipitated a switch from relatively harmless drugs, such as cannabis, which is present in urine for several weeks, to much more deleterious drugs, such as heroin, which is undetectable in urine a few days after use. Why then do you think it is that the UK government is still yet to take heed of this type of pattern, where drug crackdowns only produce increasingly adverse consequences?
Yeah, well, it's partly for the reason that you mentioned in the beginning of your question. It's partly because that their mindset is not about harm reduction. In essence, British drug policy, since we had a policy, so back in the early 1900s, has been about stopping people using drugs. Yeah, simple theory. If no one uses a drug, there's no harm from drugs. But that's, after 100 years, I think we can be pretty confident that hasn't worked. It isn't going to work. In fact, there are multiple examples of where, when you crack down on drug use, people move to more harmful kinds of drugs. I mean, 1914, in the Opium Act, banned the smoking of opium in the context, in the guise that Chinese people in San Francisco, in the East End of London, were corrupting young women in these countries by smoking opium. So opium was banned. What happens? Well, people start injecting morphine and then heroin. You know, so that was the first example of prohibition leading to a worse kind of outcome. And then American alcohol prohibition, made it difficult for people to get beer. They started drinking methanol and going blind. And you know, we've seen sequences of this all the way to the present day, but we haven't learned. The government hasn't learned. And the reason it hasn't learned is because it still cherishes some kind of bizarre belief that if you punish enough people hard enough, then they will stop using drugs. And it's bound, it's obviously false. It's a completely stupid concept, because particularly with hard drugs like heroin, every heroin addict knows someone who's died. They know each time they take heroin, they might die. That doesn't deter them. Going to prison isn't going to do. So, you know, they knew all along that the policy wouldn't work, but they perpetuate it because the media like it. The media, they like the idea that punishing people is kind of, it's more satisfying to the readers of the right-wing newspapers. The British people have a weird, there's a sort of, seeing other people suffer somehow makes them feel better. So it's a punitive society. They want to punish drug users rather than try to help them and try to reduce the harms to them, even though harm reduction in drug use reduces harms to non-drug users, because you get cleaner streets and you get less HIV, etc. But it's a kind of primitive. I think a lot of it comes in the political class from the Victorian public school, where kids were beaten so much while they were at school, they'd spend the rest of their life trying to find some other people to beat up. Drug addicts are very easy to beat up. They don't vote, they don't fight back.
Well, the UK model for controlling drug use sits in stark contrast to the Portugal model. Could you explain the situation there and why it is a more auspicious or inauspicious drug system for reducing levels of addiction, drug abuse, and overall harm caused by drugs to society?
Yeah, I mean, the Portuguese system is a very exciting and interesting development, and people think that the Portuguese system is essentially decriminalizing personal drug possession. So instead of going to prison for possessing heroin, you go into treatment. Why did the Portuguese bring it in? They brought it in because their prisons were being filled with people who were caught in possession of drugs. And putting people in prison is very expensive. We have doubled our prison population in the last 30 years. We're talking about building new prisons because that doubling of the population is all drug crime. There's no, we've put our prisons under enormous pressure because we put people who use drugs into prison. That's really expensive, £40,000 a year to put someone in prison for a drug crime. And to serve no purpose, people often use more drugs in prison than outside. So that we're at the point now where people are saying, we need drug-free we need specific drug-free wings in prisons for prisoners who don't want to use drugs. The whole thing is a self-evident farce. So Portugal was in the same boat, but worse. It was going into economic kind of collapse as a result of the war on drugs. And they said, well, let's try something different. Let's try treating drug users as human beings. And instead of putting them in prison, let's treat them. And it was remarkable. I mean, it's a fantastic experiment. It was done in the face of enormous opposition from the WHO, from the United Nations and the USA, who all said this is immoral and outrageous, and you're in breach of the UN conventions on drugs. But they did it. And now we've looked back now. There's a paper we published in the DrugScience Journal just a couple of years ago, 15 years of the Portuguese policy. And in that, the key statistic is in that's 15 years, deaths from heroin in Portugal have fallen to 1/3 of what they were before. Whereas in Britain, they've increased to 2/3 of what they were at the same time. So our policy of punishing users and not treating them means that they end up dying because they get crap drugs or they get infections. Whereas if you treat them as human beings, they don't get crap drugs, they don't get infections. And Portugal also reduced its expenditure on prisons, its expenditure on police, because if you're not arresting people, you don't need police. It reduced its HIV rates, etc. So there was a whole series of benefits from this decriminalization approach. And I have no question whatsoever in my mind that we should do the same in Britain. The most logical policy is to decriminalize personal possession of all drugs. Personally, I go further. I'd actually quite like to have some kind of regulated market of some other drugs to take people away from alcohol. But at the very least, decriminalizing personal possession would make an enormous difference to so many people's lives, both drug users' lives and also the rest of our lives.
What sort of drugs would you like to see kind of on the market then?
Regular, yeah. My view is that a drug that's less harmful to the user than alcohol should be available in a regulated way, because people will switch, and therefore you'll reduce the harms of alcohol. So the net benefit to society will be positive. People will use less alcohol and they might use other drugs, but the other drugs are not very harmful. So we should definitely regulate drugs which used to be legal, like magic mushrooms. We should definitely regulate cannabis. I'd regulate ecstasy. I'd regulate LSD. Those are the four that I think most obvious ones to put into a regulated market. And that market could be a pharmacy. It doesn't have to be a drug shop. It could just be a place where they sell other kinds of drugs, like paracetamol and stuff.
Okay. Could you talk about the current drug classification system in the UK and why it poses such a problem to scientists such as yourself?
So this is quite a complicated answer. So people talk about class A, class B, and class C drugs. The classes, they define the penalties for possession or dealing. But there's another set of controls, which are called the schedules. And the schedules effectively say what doctors can do. And most illegal drugs are in Schedule 1, pretty much all illegal drugs. If they're not a medicine already, they're in Schedule 1. In fact, some drugs in Schedule 1 used to be medicines, but they were taken out of medicine because Schedule 1 says you have no medical value. So MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, Schedule 1. So Schedule 1 says no medical value and enormously dangerous. So to research these drugs, you've got to convince ethics committees that they're not really dangerous. And you've got to go through the bureaucracy of Schedule 1, which means you've got to have special safes. You've got to have video cameras monitoring you when you go into the safe in case you accidentally or deliberately sniff a bit. So Schedule 1 drugs are treated as, like plutonium, they're treated as the most dangerous drugs of all. Whereas drugs, as I say, like psilocybin, they're almost innocuous. And there's no one's going to be trying to break into some kind of secure fridge or safe to get psilocybin. But I have to have a special safe for my psilocybin. I can store my heroin in another place because that's a Schedule 2 drug, because that's a medicine. So Schedule 1 drugs are almost impossible to work with in Britain. Cannabis was a Schedule 1 drug until 2 years ago, when eventually pressure from parents of children with severe epilepsy, they persuaded the health secretary to move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. A Schedule 2 drug are drugs like heroin, morphine, and now cannabis. And they can be prescribed by doctors, and that makes it a lot easier to do clinical work with them.
How do we change what schedule a drug is in? I suppose this is kind of where drug science, the drug science comes in.
It's interesting. You say, my charity DrugScience, we've been campaigning for 10 years to get drugs rescheduled. The drugs which shouldn't be in Schedule 1, the drugs that were medicine, LSD and psilocybin, 40,000 patients were treated with LSD in the 1950s and 60s. We know it's safe. We know it's effective. We know it treats alcoholism. It treats other disorders. But the government just decided it didn't have medical value because the Americans said it didn't. And one thing is very important you want to know, until 2015, every single aspect of our Misuse of Drugs Act had been made at the behest of America. They have over the last 40 years forced us to do what they wanted. I don't know what pressure they apply. I don't know what incentives they give, but they've achieved their goals. They've consistently tried to move our drug laws so that they're the same as theirs. And so I've lost the track. So what should we do about it? Well, the first thing we should do is we should now perhaps look at what's happened in America. Now they have cannabis is legal, recreational. 200 million Americans have access to medical cannabis, about 150 million to recreational cannabis. Let's follow America's example in liberalizing drugs, shall we? Oregon last year voted for magic mushrooms to be made legal. Let's follow the good things that America does, and not just comply with their more negative things. So that was the first thing I'd say. And we've been campaigning. And so have many other groups. There's a policy group in Manchester University that's been campaigning as well. But the move, the only move that's ever been achieved was when cannabis was moved from Schedule 2 to Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 in 2018, and that was driven by parents of children, parents who were seeing their children dying of severe epilepsy, who were going overseas where they could access medical cannabis, getting their children effectively cured or certainly much improved, trying to bring the drug back and having the drugs taken away at the airports and their kids collapsing into severe epilepsy and threatening to die. And that it was that threat of particularly Billy Caldwell, dying and across the river from the Houses of Parliament that actually forced the change in the law. So in the end, I think patient power is going to have much more influence on governments than scientists like me or policy, advocates.
How does the Psychoactive Substances Act complicate things? Is that what it's referred to?
Yeah. I mean, the Psychoactive Substances, that this is truly the worst piece of legislation. Some people say, since the Dangerous Dogs Act, I doubt if any of you listening to this have ever heard of the Dangerous Dogs Act, but there was an act of Parliament that basically said dangerous dogs could be put down and dogs should be registered. It was never enforced. Anyway, the Psychoactive Substances Act was brought in 2015 by Theresa May because she was led to believe by some very right-wing, very puritanical, very moralistic lobby groups that new psychoactive substances were destroying the youth of the country. And even though they lied about these substances, even though the Home Office itself said there were almost no deaths from these new psychoactive substances, the 2015 election became run. All three of the main parties in that election agreed that new psychoactive substances, NPS, were dangerous things, and they all agreed to be really hard on them. And it was a classic example of how drug policy is made. Any party that just tries to be rational on drugs will be vilified by the press as being soft. So rationality is seen as soft. The only way you treat drugs is by being hard and locking people up and by banning drugs. So it was the easiest piece of legislation in 2015, even though we fought it and the House of Lords fought it. The Psychoactive Substances Act was brought into law. And so basically it bans any drug which it stimulates or depresses your nervous system, with the exception of alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. And why are those exempt? They're exempt on the grounds of precedence, not on the grounds of harm. And that statement in itself categorically proves that the drug laws are not about saving health or reducing harms. They're about perpetuating a belief system, which is that alcohol is okay and new things aren't. So it was a truly despicable piece of legislation. And of course, it's the only piece of legislation that doesn't actually mention a drug. So we've been challenging it. I've been becoming a defense witness in a series of court cases. You go to court and someone's accused of having sold a psychoactive substance. And then I'm an expert witness, and the jury said, well, tell us, Professor Nutt, what's a psychoactive substance? And I said, well, it's a substance that's defined as psychoactive by the Psychoactive Substances Act. And they said, well, give us an example. And I said, the only examples I can give you are alcohol and tobacco and caffeine, but they're not in the Act. The Act itself does not mention a single drug. And the jury say, what? Well, hang on. How do we do? So each time someone is prosecuted under this Act, you've got to go to a jury, and the jury has to decide whether the drug they were using is psychoactive or not. And sometimes they say it is. So for the same drugs, most of the cases have been around nitrous oxide. Sometimes they say it's not psychoactive. Sometimes they say it is. I mean, it's an absurd situation. It wastes vast amounts of money. Have you any idea how much it costs to run a court case in Britain? It costs up to about £6,000 a day to prosecute someone for selling nitrous oxide balloons. I mean, it is absurd. But this is I say personally, this is the worst piece of legislation, because it's a moral-based legislation. There's a moral opposition to people using something like nitrous oxide. And when I suppose if you've got to go back a long way to find a morally based piece of legislation. You've got to go back to 1559, when Elizabeth I banned the Catholic communion on the grounds that it was immoral. So there's a kind of comparable kinds of legislation. They're all about trying to stop people doing something you don't like, under the pretext that somehow it's dangerous.
Okay. So for my final question, I'd like to know whether or not you're optimistic for the future with regards to our society's relationship with drugs. Do you think drug policy will change for the better and act as a mechanism that protects people from addiction and provides help to those suffering from severe medical conditions? Or do you think it will continue to punish the most vulnerable in society, as well as burdening our economy?
Well, it all depends on whether one of the two major parties has the courage of its convictions. They all know, everyone knows, 80% of politicians don't believe in the drug laws, but they believe that they have to perpetuate the current myth that punishment works in order to appease the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph. And so our policy is driven by newspaper editors. If one of the major parties would say, this is rubbish, we're going to do it differently, I think they would get such an enormous surge of support, particularly from young people, that they might well force the other party to agree. But at present, you see them both competing to be as hard on drugs as the other, because they're terrified that that will be used against them, but particularly again by the right-wing media. But am I optimistic? Yes, I'm optimistic, because we've made progress. The fact that we now have cannabis available as a medicine, actually not on the NHS, only 2 prescriptions on the NHS in 2 years. It's outrageous that they said it's a medicine, but the NHS won't prescribe it. But at least in the private system, you can get it. And one of the things my charity has done is actually brought the price of medical cannabis down to £150 a month in the private sector. So actually, the majority of people now can afford it. And we do have special concessions to those who can't. So at least we do have medical cannabis. And I reckon in a few years, we'll have medical MDMA based on our work and other people's work, and also medical psilocybin. I just cannot see how any government, not even the most right-wing, how they could resist allowing access of these medicines. I mean, yes, I don't think they'll be recreational, probably not in my lifetime, but certainly I'm pretty, I cannot, it would be absurd. I mean, it would be even more absurd than where we are now to deny them as medicines. And all that means is move them from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 and allow doctors to prescribe them. And that, we absolutely guarantee there'll be there will be no diversion. I mean, psilocybin is not addictive, so people aren't going to get it. You're going to get it once or twice a year. And MDMA, again, it's 1 or 2 doses during a therapy, a course of treatment. So the likelihood of these drugs actually becoming on the street and people having fun with them via medicine it's just trivial. So I think it will. I think it will have to happen, because I think patient pressure will actually force that.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. I know how busy you are, and you're doing great work for kind of.
Well, thank you for asking. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much. And there's the book. Shall I just show you the book just in case they don't know? Yeah. You've probably got it there. There you go.
Yeah.
all the proceeds to my charity, DrugScience. And if I'm ever giving a talk publicly again, if I'm ever allowed out, bring it along and I'll sign it for you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was great. I know you.